Welcome to Morgan James Radio. This is the show to help authors find the right path. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and David Hancock, the founder of Morgan James Publishing, is not with us today, so we're going to go right to our guest, who I'm very excited about. Our guest today is Tom Dutta, and he is the first guest from our friendly neighbor to the north, Canada. Hello, Tom. Thank you so much for joining me on the Morgan James Radio.
Well, hello, Jody. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Usually we start this show with David Hancock telling us how he knew you, his connection to you. But without David, I'm going to bring that to you. Tom, how did you and David get connected?
Well, thanks, Jody. Well, first of all, I consider being part of the Morgan James family that people like yourself and David are members of our family. And so when you talk about the family tree and connect back to how you've met, you know, the story leading up to meeting David and Morgan James is an interesting one for me. In 2000, a couple of years ago, I went to Michigan, Holland, Michigan, to meet with a company, and the company put me through a day, which we call that the Discovery Lab. And if you get to know my background, I'm a CEO, I'm an executive, and I've spent 30 years, really both sides of the border, working in corporate America across 5 different sectors. And so over the years, I've acquired all this knowledge in my head, and I had this desire to take a journey and meet with someone to help me turn that into a business of some kind. And so I journeyed up to Michigan. It was a referral from a friend of mine to meet a fellow up there named John. And we did the Discovery Lab, and in a day, you know, he pulled out of my head all the wisdom that I had over the last 30 years building and growing companies, and we turned it into an incredible business model. It was really a blueprint. And so I left Michigan and came home, and the plan was to start building the company. And my company is called KRE-AT, with a K, KRE-AT. As I was leaving Michigan, John, who was my mentor and the founder of the company I met with, he said, Tom, he says, you need to write a book. And he gave me his book, and it was about thought leadership. And the first thing I thought about was, I have a graveyard of books at home. I have a box actually in my office and never get to read those books. I find books kind of boring if they're not written right. And I said, thanks, John. I said, why should I write a book? And he said, well, the book is your calling card to your business. And I said, John, I've thought about writing a book. When I was in high school, my teacher said I had a bit of a gift of writing. I used to write poetry, and somebody said once you should publish it. But I said, I have no reason to write this book. And he said, if your book has a purpose behind it, he says that then you're going to want to do it. So he said to me, you go and you figure out a way to do it. So I left, and quite frankly, I was excited on the airplane coming back to Vancouver, but I didn't know, Jody, how I was going to proceed because I'd never done this before. I knew a lot of authors who said you should self-publish or you should do traditional publishing. Everybody was telling me what to do, including John. So when I got back home, I went on LinkedIn and I actually Google searched the word book and author, and up popped 10 different names. I use LinkedIn for networking in my business. I love it. And this woman came first on the list, and the first page of her book popped up, and I read it and I was shocked. And I remember reading it saying, I have to meet this person. The reason why I was shocked is because it was a book about the story of her life. And I won't get into the detail except to tell you that this woman was tortured by her late husband, attempted to murder her in front of her children. And she wrote a story about her struggles in life and became a heroine. So I stalked her, and then 2 weeks later, I met her in a Starbucks, and she said, I don't meet strange people very often like you, especially men. And she told me her story. And as we were talking, I said to her, you know what? I have my own story that has some parallels to yours from my childhood, and yet I'm an executive. And she said, Tom, you need to write a book. And I said, why? She said, because men won't tell their story of vulnerability. She said, if you're standing on a stage as a CEO, there will be people in the audience in tears wanting to hear more, especially the men. I said, great. So she said, Tom, start writing. She said, I will be your mentor. She said, I'm going to bug you. You got to get writing. I said, okay. So we left that coffee meeting. And again, I was excited, but I was kind of a bit distressed and lost because I didn't quite know. John told me to start writing a book. This woman did, yet I didn't know how to do it. So I got on the phone and I called John back. I said, John, look, I got to find the money and I'm going to do this. And he said, Tom, I want you to call Michael Levin. So I picked up the phone. I said, who's he? And he said, well, you just call him. He said, he's out of Boston. I believe that's where he lives. And I called Michael and we had a phone call and the rest was history. Michael said, Tom, He said, smart people write books and they do it as a team. And he said, I'm going to collaborate with you. And based on the way we wrote the book as a business book for leadership and a fable, I was honored to meet Michael because he had expertise I didn't. And it was through that process that I said, well, great, you're going to collaborate and help me write the book. How does it work with publishing? And he said, well, I got that all worked out. He said, I'm going to introduce you to David Hancock and the team in Morgan James. And well, that's the long story. And that's how I met, Morgan James. And it was a dream because the experience working with Morgan James has been nothing but top notch.
That is a great story. And we're going to come back to that, working with Morgan James, but I want to dig into this book a little bit. So the book, your book, is The Way of the Quiet Warrior, 90 Days to the Life You Desire. So this is based on a coaching and mentorship formula called The Way of the Quiet Warrior. So let's begin right there. That's such an intriguing name, first of all. So before we talk about the book, tell us about The Way of the Quiet Warrior.
Yeah, absolutely, Jody. Well, it's interesting. So I'm going to tell you that part of creating the business, I mentioned that I went to Michigan and we worked on this business and out came the plan. One of the things that businesses really linked to some observations I had throughout my life. And as an executive, especially as a very successful executive or a high level exec, I discovered that when I got to be a CEO, and it took a bit of time to get there, and I thought everything would be what I wanted it to be, but happiness was missing. And I discovered working in the corporate community that a lot of senior leaders or business leaders, they're highly successful, but happiness is missing. And I like to say success is incredible, but happiness lasts a lifetime. A lot of these people, including me, can live in quiet desperation. I was living my life. I had I was paid very well and had a great lifestyle, but there was always something missing. And so The Way of the Quiet Warrior is a six-step mentoring and coaching program that I developed based on the journey I took from 2007. So I started in 2007, really doing things that were different outside of my work as a CEO. For example, I journeyed down and I was mentored by people like Tony Robbins. I was immersed in work with Napoleon Hill of Think and Grow Rich ilk, and many other things that I did to try and really discover why are people successful, and yet along the way, some people lose their soul. And what I found also is there was a trend that many of these people who were successful but lost their soul along the way were on the unthinking treadmill of life. In other words, they were in a place or in a job just because somebody said that they need to be in that job. And I realized that there is a need, especially in the business community, for coaching and mentoring. In fact, the next generation of millennials, research shows, there's some great Gallup research on this, that millennials don't want bosses, they want coaches. They want people who have taken the journey that they're going to take to guide them. And so throughout my career, I stumbled. I started off very successful, but I fell into the graveyard of leadership many times. I lost a job. I had tough feedback on my style of leadership. And that leads back again to The Way of Quiet Warrior. You see, my father was a militaristic taskmaster. He was a commanding officer in the Canadian Forces, and he was a very bad drunk. And the rules I learned in my childhood, I carried that forward into my leadership. And so when I went out into the real world as a young man, I started leading people in a way that wasn't really the way you should. And some of the people that I coach and mentor, top leaders, can't figure out or understand why they're misunderstood or why they sometimes stumble or why there are things holding them back. And so in 2007, when I started researching, I discovered several things. One is that setting goals on their own to be successful, goals on their own in and themselves don't work. You have to have a connection that goes far deeper to a burning desire inside. What is your true purpose? Why are you on the planet? I don't believe leaders or CEOs like myself are put here to sit in chairs and make millions for shareholders or run business. I believe that we all have this calling. Joseph Campbell, I'm a fan of his research on the hero's journey. And so I thought, well, why don't I create this 6-step unique process that nobody else has to help people get from being in a place where maybe they're stuck, maybe lost a job, maybe they're on this unthinking treadmill and they're unhappy, maybe their personal life, something is not working in their relationship, or maybe there's a glass ceiling and he or she just can't push through it at work and get to where they want to go. Or maybe they were feeling like I was, that I achieved high level of success, but it just wasn't feeling fulfilled. And so when we created The Way of the Quiet Warrior, we built 6 unique steps, and they're in the book. And that's why we wrote the book as a leadership book and a fable. The 6 steps are scattered throughout the book, and in between are real life stories that are actually fictionalized. So you can see the life story, and then you can see the solution. How do you sort through that? So I can tell you about the 6 steps very quickly, but I'm hoping people will check out the book and you'll be able to get a full understanding of that. The first step I call the self, and what are your strengths and limitations, and why do you do what you do? In phase 1 of The Way of the Quiet Warrior, it's really about understanding personality, understanding character, and the motives behind why we do what we do, whether it's in our personal life or whether we're leaders. Phase 2 is the vision. This is really getting into that deep stuff about what is your purpose. And less than 5% of people, I understand, actually discover their true purpose in life. And I didn't. I was doing things in business, but I didn't really know what my true purpose was till I discovered this. So phase 2 is creating that vision and really mapping it out. What is my life going to look like in 5 years? What's that burning desire? Where am I trying to go? Phase 3, we call that the path. And that is, what is the secret to success? In phase 3, we teach a lot of using motivational science and ancient wisdom that's been out there for decades. We teach very successful people how to use the power of the mind and those tools, how to manifest success and how to move down the path towards not just success, but happiness. Phase 4, well, that's the blueprint. And so once we've got the vision, we've learned how to manifest it using some of the tools, especially the subconscious mind. The blueprint really lays out the specifics of the strategy. What are the goals to create the results that you might want? Phase 5 is what we call the launch. How will you get in motion and who's going to walk with you? And this is where we really move forward. In 90 days, we kick off the journey to actually building the dream or creating the action behind that blueprint. And then phase 6, which I believe is really key, is nobody succeeds without the power of what I call, and Hill called the mastermind, but this is really the community. So I believe that if you're trying to change your life or create a different pathway, you can't do it alone. You have to have a community. And so in our Way of the Quiet Warrior, which again, we've trademarked and it's unique, we have resources or peer mentoring and coaching. And so this is what we call our flagship program, The Way of the Quiet Warrior. And I can tell you from the work I've done in the corporate sector as an executive, I've had many coaches and many people, they'll sit down with you and say, Jody, let's have a conversation and let's set some goals. And that actually is 3 steps into my process. What's forgotten is really the self and the vision. I can tell people because I have a unique skill. I understand motives. I understand why people do what they do. You know, people will set goals, but they'll fall off the pathway into the graveyard and they just can't keep moving forward. We help people understand what are the natural limitations that are within them, what's holding them back. Finish with this, that all of this connects to my personal story. So it's part of one of the other reasons I wrote the book, in that I talk about leadership and leading in your whole life. A lot of people think leadership, Jody, is just leading in your business, but are you leading in your whole life? And if you've heard of the wheel of life, there's many spokes on the wheel. One is health, one is family, one is relationships. And what I've discovered and I teach is that past events in life have a direct connection to the present and future of your leadership. And so if I go back to my story, which is throughout the book, of being, a kid who came from a toxic childhood, I call myself a black and blue kid sometimes. When I take that, which is buried in my subconscious thinking, that was holding me back throughout my career. Even though I became successful, I feared difficult people. I worried too much about why things wouldn't work out. And yet other leaders were pushing through problems and being successful, and I was curious why. And so this really relates back to understanding those natural limitations, understanding more about self. And when I coach and I mentor people and I work in the corporate sector, I come across a lot of leaders, men and women, who all have a story, and it usually comes out. They have addiction issues, they have alcoholic parents, maybe they had a loss of a child, or something in their life from the past that they haven't dealt with, and it plagues them throughout their success moving forward. Maybe they reach a level of success, but they're just not happy. And so the Way of the Quiet Warrior is meant to move people to discover purpose, take massive action, and really create the life that they desire.
Well, now let's turn to the process of actually turning a coaching and mentoring formula that you had developed into a book. Did it help that this was something that you already had developed, or was it really a challenge to put 30 years of experience into a book?
Well, I mean, you can probably tell that in my work I do, I'm what we call a blue personality. So I'm about quality and service, and I'm a little verbose. I talk a lot, and that's just the nature of somebody who thinks that detail. And so I've never been able to take wisdom out of my head and turn it into anything effectively. I could tell you that I could try to write a book on my own, and it would come out probably not in the way I want. And so it was somewhat, we started doing the project, I was amazed how easy it was. And when we took the idea of turning the book into a business book, but also fictionalizing the characters, it made it very easy. So, for example, when I was in the corporate sector, I had a nickname. My nickname was Tommy Gunn. And you might laugh, but Tommy, a hired gun in corporate is somebody gets hired by boards or companies to make change. Sometimes tough change, sometimes reorganizing companies, sometimes having to fire people and that type of thing. And as I went through my hero's journey, starting in 2007, discovering about why I was not happy and what was missing in my life, I emerged as the quiet warrior. And so the idea of writing the book and turning it into my life story was not as hard as I thought. One of the things that I would do is I would be interviewed and really just dump. Once we framed the chapters of the book, I would just start going back and recollecting each chapter of my life. We started when I was a boy. We progressed through my career. And I would take a whiteboard and, over a period of a week, just keep manifesting information, throw it up on that whiteboard. I actually took pictures of the whiteboards, and it looks like a cluttered mess. But working with my team, what we did is we turned that into a sense of a timeline. And then when we attached those fictional stories to the 6 phases of the Way of the Quiet Warrior, it became I guess I'm just going to say as the author that I was overwhelmed at how successful it came together. But to be truthful, it was a scary process for me, because trying to take a lifetime of information and put it in a 200 and some odd page book, I didn't think we could do it. But it's remarkable, and I'll say this to any author listening to me, that all you need is within you. And it is amazing, if you find the right team to work with, that you can take your lifetime of information and turn it into a story. Anybody can do that. And take the worry out of your head that it's too much information or how I'm going to do it. And just put those aside and let somebody guide you through it.
Well, having been through this process, starting as somebody who didn't want really to write a book, but it just kept popping up that you should. So that's where you start. And now you've written a book that is, well, I guess parts this coaching program, parts your own life, and parts of Fable. That's an interesting journey. So what advice do you have for authors trying to find the right path? There's people out there that know they've got a book in them, or they've started and it's just not shaping up. What did you learn in that whole process that could help others?
Sure. Well, I knew that, especially from some of the self-work I did, I knew that there's 2 basic human fears that I think everybody has. And one is the fear of not being loved and enough. And the other one is the fear of failure. And if you just think about it, what held me back from writing my true story or writing a book was the fear of failure. I didn't know how to do it. I was also afraid of vulnerability. I thought, well, even if I put myself out there, the author, based on my true life story, that maybe people would be critical, maybe I would lose friends. And so I dealt with that when we started writing this book. That's what held me back from writing it, but I dealt with that right away. And I put that aside and I said, you know what, I'm going for it, judgment free. And I believed and I visualized the book being in the hands of somebody. I visualized somebody reading it. And I remember what really got me moving forward with the book, and my message to other authors, that I defined a purpose for the book right up front. And so I want to share with you what that is. And the purpose of my book, I believe if my book is a bestseller, to me, that means that somebody, maybe Jody, picks it up and reads it. And in that book, you see yourself. And Joseph Campbell called it the hero's journey. And, he put average people into heroic situations. I want people, when they read my book, because it has many stories in it of real life people, I want them to say, oh my gosh, that's me. That was me when I was in business. That was me when I was lost. That was me when I lost a child or I went through a traumatic situation. And if it gives you hope that you're not alone and that you can take action and move forward, then my book is a success. So when I finally discovered, and this was back probably around 2009, what my true purpose is, which is to find people who are like me and help them find a pathway forward, I anchored that purpose, and it made it easy to write the book. The other thing I'll say to authors is that, listen to other authors' advice. And why are there so many authors that write books, and yet here I was stumbling and not writing a book? Well, I didn't have the resources and the team to do it. And when I discovered Morgan James, how easy it was to work with your company to do the publishing, I thought, boy, I wish I had known that a long time ago. So talk to other authors and find out that the pathway is not difficult. It takes care of some of that fear. And I also made a decision that all of the proceeds from my book are going to go to charity. And so I have two charities. I have a foundation in my company. One of the charities is to help people who are with mental illness, and second is to feed the hungry. And so when I anchored those two things, my deep purpose of the book is to help change lives and get people to see themselves move forward, and also to give back in some way meaningful with the success of the book. It made it that much easier to move forward. And I couldn't believe, Jody, that over the last 30 years, I've been talking about writing a book. And it's really what the way of the Quiet Warrior says. Talk is cheap, but find your purpose, set an intention, and put it on the radar, and just have somebody who's going to mentor you and move you forward to do it. I would say to you that leading up to the book, one of the barriers in my mind was money. And when I finally discovered that I could overcome that barrier once I understood the process and what it took, then I could plan to write the book. I probably could have planned to write this book 10 years ago if I had known what I know today.
Well, Tom, this has been a real treat for me to spend time with you today and find out your story and about your book. Where can we find out more about you?
Absolutely. So you can go to my website. It's www.KRE-AT.ca. That's KREAT.ca. I've got a book page up there. It'll take you to my Amazon page as well. On my website is my professional bio, my speaker's kit. It's all there. And I'm also on LinkedIn. If anybody uses LinkedIn, they can hook up with me, and I'm happy to help them through my network as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Tom. And thank you for listening to Morgan James Radio.